Hi, my name is Kayla Hurst, and today I'll be presenting on the Mesoamerican Ballgame. The first time I was introduced to this game was actually at the Fresno Art Museum, where they had some super cool artifacts on display, and I immediately wanted to know more. And so, in this presentation, I'm just going to be sharing some of the things that I've learned. It's often called the sport of life and death, and this is for two main reasons. One of them is that on some occasions it did result in sacrifices, but the other one is that it was very symbolic of life and death, also day and night, and the balance between the heavens and the underworld. So the first evidence of a ball court is in the central Gulf of Mexico, dating back to the 1500s BC. For significant games, which were those played on important dates, like the equinoxes, they had an extreme religious value, and those were the ones that often ended in the sacrificial ceremonies. It was believed that the underworld could be reached through the ball court, and the games were played to keep the balance of energy in the universe. The Olmecs are credited with creating the game because the rubber trees, which were used to make the rubber ball, came from the coastal Gulf region. But the ball game was played throughout Mesoamerica. There were also many, many different names that it's known as, and different variants based on who was playing and what time they were playing. How the game was played. So, the shapes of the court did vary. However, they were typically in the shape of a capital I. The game was played by two teams, 5 to 8 players. However, it could vary a little bit on the number of players as well. Points could be scored many different ways, but they all had to do with rubber ball. And there were specific rules which differed by location. The ball courts were mainly placed in major cities, indicating that they were culturally and politically significant. They were located in the sacred precincts by temples, and they were also used to host festivals, ceremonies, and feasts. So, here's that example. Rules of the game. So, how to score. So if the other team failed to return, if they hit the ball out of bounds, then you would receive a point. If it landed in the end zone, then they would receive a point. If the markers are hit, or if the ball was shot in the hoop, those would all receive points. However, if the ball was shot through the hoop, that would generally mean that the game was terminated. And this is because the hoops were, the holes were incredibly small, and that rarely happened. Some other rules were that players were not allowed to touch the ball with their hands or their feet. Instead, they had to rely on their hips, thighs, knees, elbows, and head. And there were two different theories of how the ball was transitioned between team and team. So one of them was volleyball, and then one of them was tennis. In the volleyball style game, the ball was kept in the air, and the game would end when the ball hit the ground. However, for games played in a bigger court, that usually didn't happen. Instead, it was a tennis version of the game. So the play would come to an end when the ball stopped moving on one of the team sides. So, who watched and who played? The game was very popular, and therefore probably played by majority of the population. However, those games would have been on more informal courts. It was often played by nobles, and there were even professional players who would make a living off of the prizes or their sponsorship by royals. The crowds of spectators usually consisted of nobles and elite classes. Gambling was extremely present during these games, and they were known to bet jewels, slaves, stones, and even territories of land. So here would be a picture of that. What was the attire? So typically loincloths or short skirts were worn while playing. But when playing with a 9-pound ball, that could get dangerous and hurtful really quickly. So they would use protection such as leather, wood, or even woven padding. Oftentimes they would also wear gloves to protect them from the floor or from the wall. So all of this gear was needed to protect their body from the ball, from slamming into the walls or scraping themselves on the ground. So this would be an example of what's sometimes referred to as a uke. It would be worn around their hips and it would offer protection. So these ball games were hugely culturally and religiously important. So along with the protective gear, their attire might contain or include elaborate headdresses or other ceremonial apparel. So more about the ball. The ball was made of solid rubber and it could weigh up to 9 pounds. Again, the rubber to make the balls came from the Mexican coastal Gulf, and the ball was meant to symbolize the sun being passed between the heavens and the underworld. Religious and cultural significance. It was meant to represent the cycle of death and rebirth. That's why the equinoxes were very important dates, not only in the Mayan calendar, but also the games were scheduled on those equinoxes. Many of the ball games were played on these days to mark the battle between celestial and infernal forces. And because the games were played on such religious days, there's a connection between them and sacrifices. Some historians believed the losing team would be killed, while others say it was just the leader or the coach who would be killed. And it's often depicted as a beheading. So in this image, as you can see, there's one teammate or player being beheaded on one side, and then you have another on the other side. So this is just another example of a sacrifice. I just wanted to include this in here because it's a really good picture. How do we get this information? So most of the information that we have has come from the actual courts themselves. And there are over 1,000 archaeological remains that have been found and analyzed, and that's how historians have kind of depicted the game and connected the dots a little bit. But there's still a lot that they don't know, right? There are also many other artifacts, such as the balls, the attire, and the art, which can provide a lot of information. The other main way that historians got information was from written evidence, so from the Mesoamericans, but also from the Spanish chroniclers of the 16th century. And that's also how people now in Mexico, that's what they're relying on to kind of learn about aspects of their native cultures. So, what has this ancient game inspired? Well, the game has now become known as ulama, and during the Inquisition, the sport was banned, causing the popularity and the influence of the game to diminish. And also, it deprived them of their culture in a way. So now there are many communities, specifically in Mexico, trying to revive the sport, and it's being played by both men and women, and there's a huge significance placed on passing the tradition down to children. I just wanted to include this little YouTube video. It's like 2 minutes long, but it's really good, and it gives a lot of information. So here we go.
Not far from the archaeological site of Teotihuacan in the state of Mexico, a team of 4 play an ancient ball game called ulama. It was forbidden during the Spanish conquest in the 1500s, but now ulama is undergoing a resurgence thanks to the young Mexicans who have tried to retrieve the rules and meaning behind the sport.
What we're trying to do now is to understand the different ways this game was played, studying ancient texts, reading what the conquest reported about this activity, decrypting codices in order to imitate this game.
The event starts with a ceremony. Arturo recites a prayer in Nahuatl, the language spoken by the Aztecs. The game represents the battle between day and night, and playing it was believed to balance the forces of the universe.
We would like others to get to know about the link with heaven and earth, to thank all the things that have been offered to us.
The sound of the drums, they say, moves the energy to clear the ballgame field. Players try to balance the ball without using their hands through stone hoops.
Around 7 different ball games were played in Mesoamerica. These were also held as ritual events, and ulama emerges as the modern version of these games.
Ricardo Tonatiu built the ulama court in Teotihuacan for young people in his community, so they could do more than just read about their culture in books.
We want the people and new generations to look at this and say, hey, why instead of playing football or soccer, we just come and play our indigenous game. That's why we are doing it.
In the past 2 years, the number of ulama teams in the country has risen from 35 to over 70, according to the Indigenous Sports Federation. The growing interest in the sport has led the federation to push for its inclusion in the Olympic Games. Valeria León, TRT World, Teotihuacan, Mexico.
So, thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I hope you learned just a little bit more about this, or maybe this is the first time you heard about it. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you so much.